Hey, welcome back to Close Read, and thanks to Ben and the guys at Cosmic Romp for the intro music. That is Get Down from their 2018 album Alien Funk. And I'll go ahead and link to that in the show notes. Feels like I have a really professional-ish podcast going because I have intro music and transition music now. Thanks again to the folks who are subscribing on Patreon. I know it's just $5, but it means a lot to me because it tells me that there's people out there who are getting value from this podcast and are learning through what I have to share and what the guests have to share. And at a practical level, it's just nice knowing that the equipment and subscription services that I'm using to produce the podcast and get it out there are getting covered by people who are enjoying and supporting the show. Also, big shout out to Sarah Myrie for our episode last week on AOC's incredible floor speech. I got a lot of really warm feedback on that, including from someone who said they listened to it with their teenage daughter. So we got some early political education going on there, which I always love to hear about. I also noticed that about 90+% of the people who were interacting with that episode, sharing it, leaving comments were women. So I did a special ask for all the men who follow me online to please give it a listen. And a few guys got back to me and responded and said, thank you, I listened to it. I learned a lot, and that was really, really great to hear. So much appreciation for that. If you haven't listened to it, I'm really proud of it. I'm really happy with what we were able to put together. Please feel free to go back and give it a listen at your leisure. This next topic that I wanted to get into today is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and it's the way in which we tend to personalize arguments around people's political positions and accuse them of hypocrisy. And very often, people interpret these arguments about hypocrisy as if they're always in bad faith. And I think there's actually a division here. There's bad faith hypocrisy arguments, and we'll cover a lot of those. I think there's also good faith hypocrisy arguments that are grounded in a real theory of change and a real demand to act and live consistently with one's politics. And I wanted to use climate as an example again, because it's something I've spent a lot of time on. But when we look at hypocrisy arguments through a climate lens, I think the distinction between bad faith and good faith arguments is a lot clearer, and it's also a lot more concrete when we have this discussion because we can actually measure what someone's carbon footprint is if they're a climate advocate and they also fly a lot or whatever. And I should say before I get into this, some of this is contentious within the climate movement, within climate advocacy circles, so that that's also where we have this internal good faith debate about theory of change. Then there's this external bad faith arguments that we get from people who are never going to support climate policy, but who want to spend every waking hour hollering about Al Gore using airplanes or whatever. So I'll do the first half of this discussion, and then I'm going to bring in Dr. Kim Cobb. And Dr. Cobb is a climate researcher with a really impressive track record of public communication. She's thought about this a lot and approaches this in a really constructive way that I think is helpful and unites her science communication work, her policy advocacy work, and the choices that she makes personally at the household level, at the institutional level, to help cut emissions and advance solutions to climate change. So the bad faith arguments, I think they fall into three categories. And the first category here is just trying to present someone as morally inconsistent. So it's about the credibility of the messenger. So someone who doesn't want climate action will want to make it look like Al Gore is untrustworthy, right? If he really thought climate change was a big deal, he would stop flying. And what's never answered there is, would someone actually go from opposing to supporting climate action if Al Gore swore off flying forever, right? But the real goal of this argument is to take the focus off of the policy, to take the focus off of the choices that we're making and put the focus back on the individual, right? So instead of having an argument about systemic change, you're having an argument about the former Vice President Al Gore and his personal choices and how he gets around the country. So in that sense, it serves as a form of distraction. The second type is to try to present someone as not fully embracing a straw man version of their policy position. So this is kind of a double-barreled argument, right? And this is to say, okay, if this person really believed that climate change were an existential crisis, they would do all these things in their personal life every waking hour to reduce their carbon emissions. But then, because they're not doing that, I can actually demonstrate that the wacky stuff that they want me to do in my mind castle related to climate change, that they really can't do it either, that all their solutions are impractical. And, a good example of this is AOC and, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the authors of the Green New Deal. She was out at dinner with one of her staff members, and one of them had a hamburger. So that there was this right-wing backlash to that, where it's like, oh my God, look, like this guy's eating a hamburger, right? So clearly their plan to take away all our cows and, shut down dairy production and take away beef, that won't work. Look at these hypocrites here. So that's why it's double barreled, because it's based on this false premise that I don't know, the feds are going to come and take the cows away. They're gonna be like the aliens who beam the cows up with the tractor beam. I don't know. It's just silly. But those sort of straw man arguments are really prevalent, right? No one's going to force you to go drive a Prius or go purchase an EV from Elon Musk or whatever. So it's an attempt to distract people by putting the focus back on the individual, right? We want to debate AOC and her staffer and what they're eating. And then even if you get past that, now I want you to debate this goofy straw man version of your policies. Instead of talking about this big transition to clean energy and away from fossil fuels, I want to yell at you about cows. That's silly. So the third form of this bad faith argument, I think, turns into demanding perfection and a ridiculous series of goalpost moving, right? So if you get someone to engage with you on this, right, and say oh yeah, great, let's talk about how much these political leaders who support climate policy fly. I really want to engage with you on this. If you if you pretend that they are engaging in good faith and you examine the argument and dig into it, the folks making this argument get into really ridiculous spots really quickly. And I wanted to share what I think is a pretty remarkable example of this. This is Adam Green with the Progressive Change Campaign Committee. He's a progressive. His organization supported Liz Warren in the primaries in 2020. And it's him on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News Channel. And what they're discussing, just to set the context a little bit here, Tucker Carlson is devoting an entire segment to Senator Bernie Sanders, the independent Democratic Socialist senator from Vermont, big supporter of climate action, big supporter of the Green New Deal. He is having an argument about Bernie using private jets to go jet around the country and talk to people. And of course, members of Congress, senators, they travel a lot, right? So it's really rare to see this argument come up, because we all sort of assume that members of Congress should, be able to travel to Washington, D.C. to do votes and then travel back home to talk to their constituents. So listen for what Adam Green does here in sort of dealing with the premise of this argument and taking it to its logical extreme.
Okay, so my point is that if you believe that carbon emissions are destroying the Earth, that's too many houses, that's too much consumption, that's too much carbon. You lead by example. Why is it the people who are trying to control my life and tell me what I can do and can't do and how many kids I can have don't bother to restrain themselves?
Again,
it's not silly, it's true.
It's silly. It's a fake hypocrisy argument. You're basically saying that, if you believe that Facebook has bad privacy policies, you shouldn't check Facebook every day. If you believe you want a better job, you shouldn't go to work
I'm saying if you think adultery is wrong, don't cheat on your wife.
If you believe in having a better economy
to attack other people
with tens of millions of jobs in the future in clean energy, of course he should spend the last few days of a campaign doing everything he can to fight for a Green New Deal.
You should reduce your own emissions. No, it's really simple. You should reduce your own emissions.
Should he walk from Vermont to D.C.?
Yes.
Should he walk from Vermont to D.C.? You just said yes. You just said yes, you should walk from Vermont to D.C.? That shows the BS argument that you just described.
Okay.
Taking a car.
What you're doing? You are making excuses because all you want is power. You're exactly the kind of person who would.
Tucker, I've seen you make better arguments.
What you're doing is exposing
from Vermont to D.C.
You're exposing the shallowness of your own argument.
Anybody who takes any plane.
This is idiotic.
Is it idiotic? You just said he should walk from Vermont to D.C. Obviously, you don't believe that.
Okay.
Obviously, you don't believe that. He's not a hypocrite for doing that. He believes in tens of millions of new jobs in the clean energy economy.
This is idiotic what you're saying, because look, you will
just
never
said he should walk from Vermont to D.C.
or your leaders.
You just said he should walk from Vermont to D.C. I asked if he should walk. You said yes. Come on, not a real argument.
You got me, Adam. You got me. You're a brilliant guy. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We're gonna.
Okay, so that was pretty shouty cable news stuff, and I don't watch a lot of cable news. It takes something truly remarkable for me to pay attention to a cable news segment at this level of detail. But Adam does a great job here exposing how silly Tucker Carlson's argument is, and he really makes it clear, like, there's no scenario where Bernie Sanders' personal actions are going to prompt Tucker Carlson to go from opposing climate policy to supporting climate policy. And we saw this with Greta Thunberg too. And I'll play a clip from the news conference she did later. Greta Thunberg sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, did not fly, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to come to the United States for some meetings on climate change, to testify before Congress about climate change. And she's great. She's brave. She's walking the walk. She's sailing the sail, right? And I think that this necessarily got a lot of attention because it's remarkable for someone to do this. She was very open about the fact that she had a relative position of privilege where she could get this world-class sailing team to sail with her. She traveled with a family member and a friend of the family too, I think. But within that context, the right-wing noise machine, the folks who are opposed to climate policy, they still wanted to have this argument with her, right? So the really extreme version of demanding perfection from climate advocates that I saw was a picture of her. She was taking a train ride, but she was done with the East Coast. She was traveling west. And it was a picture of her having lunch on the train, and there was a bag of bread in the picture. And the bread bag is, of course, made of plastic. And as we all know, plastic is derived from oil. So there was an attempt to try to nail Thunberg, who had literally sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, for like not having a non-plastic bread container. Like, it's just a bag of bread, right? But I think that shows how invested in the hypocrisy argument folks can get. And we see this too with like big picture arguments about like big business, capitalism, whatever, right? Oh, you're complaining about this from your iPhone, right? And the iPhone's great. And you can examine that at a substantive level and say like, yeah, the iPhone is great, and businesses contributed to it, and the research and development for all the components of the iPhone was heavily subsidized, by the federal government, by research and development, by basic research that the government funds that then trickles out into the private sector. Or you can just look at the argument and say like, this is goofy. Like if I were scrawling my message on the side of a wall somewhere, or if I was like scribbling it out on papyrus, that wouldn't be convincing to you anyway, right? It's just complaining about the surface level tactical stuff. And the last thing I'll say on this is that sometimes the bad faith version of this argument involves someone who's opposed to climate policy looking at somebody who's good on climate policy and also takes a lot of personal action, and holding them up as a paragon of virtue, and then trying to split people's perceptions of other people who don't do that. And to just share another specific example here, Ed Begley Jr., the actor, he's super green. He does a ton of climate advocacy work and environmental advocacy work. He also does stuff like he'll show up to award ceremonies like in a tux or whatever, and like he biked there on his electric bike or whatever. So he's known as someone who's made a lot of these choices in his own personal life. And I remember him going on Bill O'Reilly years ago, and O'Reilly was like, "Hey, Ed, like you're one of the good ones because you really walk the walk. But these other guys, they're not credible, right? They're full of it. So you take somebody who's meeting all these bad faith requirements you put out there, and then you just hold them up and say, okay, well, but these other people, Ed, they're so disgusting, they're terrible. So again, you're stuck in this position of I'm against climate policy no matter what. If billions of people all over the world suddenly all decided to cut their emissions and never fly again, I would still be against climate policy because I could find one person who didn't do that, and I would just complain about them, right? Okay. So those are the bad faith arguments, and I think the bad faith arguments they poison the discourse a lot, right? Because if we try to have a good faith conversation about this, it's really easy for the bad faith folks to come in and try to exploit that, try to troll, try to be divisive, whatever. So having established that, now let's get to the good faith disagreements that we actually have within the climate movement about these sort of arguments. So the first, and I've got three here. The first is about personal credibility, right? And this argument is that we trust messengers who walk the walk because they are taking the problems that they work on seriously. They are taking them so seriously that they are integrating solutions into their work, right? And this isn't actually that well studied, but it is intuitive. And it shows up when we talk about politicians who aren't taking fossil fuel money, for instance, right? They take a pledge to say we're not going to take fossil fuel money because we realize how corrupting it is. When we talk about institutions divesting from fossil fuels, when we talk about individual scientists, technologists, engineers refusing to work on fossil fuel projects, that's really heavy stuff, right? That's to say, like, my professional life is tied up in this issue, and I'm going to make very serious decisions about how I'm going to engage in this work because I want to contribute to solutions. And the idea that you're also taking these personal actions to cut your carbon footprint, it does demonstrate that you're taking it seriously. And as we discussed, it can have some backfire effects because it can take people to the bad faith part of it. But I do think it contributes to that credibility. I do think this is something that we probably could study better, right? Social scientists could probably do some more research in this field that we benefit from. And at the end of the day, is this something that like is make or break between being like a good climate communicator or a bad climate communicator? I don't think so. But as we'll talk with Kim Cobb later, it's definitely it's an important tool in the tool belt when you're talking about this issue because people do want to know what they can do as individual. The second piece of this is understanding environmental ethics at a personal level and at an institutional level. So these top questions we get from people when we go out and we talk about climate change is, what can I do? And sometimes those are people who are very much in a consumer mindset and they just want to know what those individual level household actions are. And part of what I've tried to do in my own work is say, okay, personal actions are great. Now let's talk about advocacy. What can you do at the institutional level? That's awesome that you want solar panels on your rooftop. Does your homeowners association let you do that? Right? Is there some institutional actions you can take there? How easy is it to hook that up to the grid? How accessible is this technology to people who maybe don't have an income that's as high as yours? What are some policies we could talk about to make this stuff more accessible as it scales up? The sort of personal actions, they speak to what people want to know. And it also gives you an opening to talk about those broader ethics, right? And I think it can also give you an opening to talk about how the individual actions and the focus on the individual isn't enough. Because, climate, like a lot of other societal level problems we're trying to address here, it's a systemic problem. And I think Greta Thunberg put this really well in a press conference she did, like literally walked right off the sailboat to do a press conference, like had not even gotten her land legs back and was taking questions from the press. But she addressed this directly, I think, in a pretty effective way.
How does it feel that the focus is so much on Greta's person here?
I mean, of course, it's a huge focus on me as an individual, and maybe in a way that takes away from the focus from the actual problem. And so, I mean, of course, I wished this was more not focused on me, but more as a whole, and but I mean, there's not much I can do about that. If what I'm doing can make a difference, and if it can create attention for the climate crisis, then I'm going to use that opportunity to try to change things.
And that brings me to the third point here, which is that we have evolving boundaries around personal agency and theories of change within any issue, but certainly within climate. So we've seen a lot of changes along these lines in the past few years. I remember people approaching me to talk about divestment from an institutional perspective, 8 or 9 years ago. And those conversations just really went nowhere because nobody had dug into it yet. But over time, we saw that, there was more acceptance of the idea that institutions should divest from fossil fuels, right? And as more people proved that they could do it, that there was an alternative pathway there, that you could get into index funds that didn't have Exxon, Chevron, BP, whatever, you could go ahead and do that. And activists worked really hard to push that boundary, to open up the Overton window, right? And to demonstrate that this is a credible theory of change. and that you can follow this. And, similarly, the personal actions that scientists have chosen to take, is pretty controversial. Some of the first people who went out there and talked about how they weren't going to fly anymore. I remember Eric Holthouse, the meteorologist and writer, he got a lot of grief when he talked about this. But now there's more climate scientists who said, I don't want to fly anymore, or I'm going to severely limit my flying to the point where it's just for my necessary work scientifically, or I'm only going to fly, once or twice a year, and I'm going to make the most of like every waking hour when I'm in a new place, if I got to go, or if I get the opportunity to testify before Congress, or I get to go give a TED talk, or I get to go to the Aspen Ideas Festival and try to convince the global financial elite that it's time to invest in solar. Let's do it. That these opportunities are worth it. And my take on a lot of this is that we often wind up having debates like this as proxies for real debates that we have about different competing theories of change within this space, right? So you might think it is absolutely necessary for people who advocate for climate solutions to walk the walk and cut emissions in their own life. And if they have the luxury to do that, right? These technologies aren't free, right? If you're a renter and not an owner, it's a little bit harder for you to make these investments in the rental property, right, than the place that you own. So I think that can get kind of muddied. But if that's someone's theory of change and that's what they want to spend a lot of time on, I don't begrudge them that. Right. And conversely, I think if somebody is totally focused on the policy debate and is really focused on pushing policymakers and doesn't think about individual carbon footprint stuff at all, that's fine too. Like, it's a movement. It's big. I think there's a lot of room for different approaches here from a communications perspective, from a theory of change perspective. And I tend to just not get sucked into this debate when it crops up, because I can see all the sides of this case, right? And where the theories of change go. And I tend to encourage other people to look the same way too, right? Like, if you're out there and you're trying to like tell a climate scientist they're not credible on this if they fly too much, I don't think that's a very good argument, because like, you don't know actually, and like everybody's audience is different too. But if you go out there and say like, hey, here's a scientist who's approaching this in a really constructive way, I really like this. Is there other stuff that other scientists can do here, or is there other stuff that other climate advocates can do, or I really like what this big green group is doing on the divestment front, and they wrote up a great report about it. I really want my local green group to do the same thing, right? That's a more constructive way to approach it, and these are all constructive ways that let us focus on the good faith theory of change debate that's worth having internal to a movement, without having bad faith folks from outside the movement hijack it, or without having record type folks who want to just debate this stuff with you endlessly from within the movement derail those conversations either. So with that, I want to bring on Dr. Kim Cobb, and she is a professor in the School of Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech and the director of the Global Change Program at Georgia Tech. She studies past climates, and she also works on climate solutions, including in Georgia. And I think what's really interesting about Dr. Cobb's work is that she's so open and transparent about how she approaches her communications work, her advocacy work. And that transparency, I think, is really interesting in the context of this conversation, and thinking through what are those choices that you're making when you're deciding to engage in these big public debates about climate change. And as Dr. Cobb puts it, how do you bring your whole self into that conversation in a way that helps enhance people's understanding of your work and also empowers them to think about climate solutions?
So I got my PhD in oceanography, and this was a while back now, when I really thought that I would be free to investigate the inner workings of the tropical Pacific Ocean and the role that it plays in the global climate system, probably for the rest of my professional life. It's an incredibly rich space. It's very enigmatic, and just layers upon layers upon layers of questions that are really pressing to a very large portion of the global population, where tropical Pacific extremes, reach into hurricane patterns, rainfall patterns, drought patterns, and also into ecosystems strength and function. So that was really my core work for much of my PhD, and specifically focused on the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is a tropical Pacific climate phenomenon as recorded in the past, and really desperately trying to understand if it's already changing today and if we could see that in the rock record of the recent past. And so really that led me down to a repeat series of expeditions in 2014, 2015, 2016, really chasing what was eventually ended up being the largest El Nino event on record in 2015 and 2016, as really a culmination of 20 years of research of the subject. So unfortunately had to bear eyewitness to the complete devastation of that reef during that climate extreme, and really came home thinking that it was all not going to be okay. It was very much not going to be okay. And that I had an opportunity where I sat at Georgia Tech to leverage the research enterprise in a more applied sense to meet some of the pressing challenges that communities are facing. And so kind of wholesale pivot into climate solutions research, transdisciplinary research frames, and really redoubled my efforts in communication as well, which continues to take up a good portion of my time.
Well, I've heard stories like that from so many scientists, and that it's so fascinating to me that, you can study these things, on paper, on computers, doing some field work, but so many people have big inflection moments like that where they see the scale of the change. My old colleague, Brenda Eckwurzel at Union of Concerned Scientists, who I'm sure you know, she talked about seeing how quickly the ice was melting in the Arctic when she was on an icebreaker research ship. And, it's always fascinating to me because we really are all human in this, right? Like seeing that can have such a powerful impact on your trajectory and how you wanted to approach your work.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say that I think it's just human nature to park in the back of your mind that there are worst case scenarios out there, but that it's pretty much going to be all right. And I think if I had to summarize most climate scientists' viewpoints, it's really that. And then slowly but surely, dominoes falling, one by one, we wake up and we realize that it's really not okay. Some of those most dire predictions are not only unfolding, but are already so far underway with such inertia that their trajectories are just shockingly awful, and that there's a very good argument to be made that some of those worst case scenarios are very plausible and maybe already in motion. So yeah, that I think is increasingly happening to a person across my community. And I think we're in the midst of a wholesale reconfiguration of the climate science community as we struggle with the fact that we may be kind of have dedicated our lives to relatively niche research fields, but that we really need to begin to understand what those mean to people today and to ecosystems today, and to try to be part of the solution that we know needs to happen, but so far has not.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about big picture solutions, and what I wanted to focus on today was sort of how scientists are approaching the personal aspects of this and how they communicate about their own personal choices when it comes to their carbon footprint, what they're able to accomplish, in their classrooms and their institutions. So to start with that, did you grow up with a big environmental ethic? Were you a hiker? Were you a recycler? Is that something that your family instilled in you when you were growing up?
Not necessarily. I mean, we did the odd camping trip, but in general, that we were not a terribly outdoorsy family. I didn't bike to school or any of that stuff. Pretty much, I guess, would have your standard upbringing. And it really wasn't until I got to college that I started to realize some of the kind of my deeper attachment personally to the outdoors through kind of college experiences. And then much, much later, actually kind of moving into graduate school and beyond, realized that that would be a very important in my life forever from a recreational standpoint. And that had probably driven a lot of my professional choices, kind of unbeknownst to me. But, to be honest with you, had never considered myself really, an environmentalist or an activist. I was a scientist first. And that was the way that I connected to the natural world. And it was perfectly sufficient until pretty recently.
Yeah. So talk to me about that change, because you've written and spoken a lot about some of the things that you've done to take advantage of the technology that's out there, the services that are out there to cut your own carbon footprint. So what does that look like, at your home and at your school?
Yeah, so I think that's been a very interesting journey, one that I would never have predicted for myself. Really spurred by the crushing realization at the end of 2016 after the election that, nobody in DC was going to wave a magic wand and save us. And even if the election had gone the way that I had hoped, nobody in DC was going to wave a magic wand and save us. And so,
for the record, there is no magic wand buried under the Capitol.
Right. Yeah, right. I mean, maybe many people knew this before I did, but again, that was something I had to really grasp at a very, very deep level, and shreds of optimism that I had been clinging to were torn away, and there was nothing left. And so there was nothing left to replace it. No strategy, no framework. And so I began in 2017 to kind of chart a path that I knew nothing about. And I determined that it would be highly personal choices, and it would be data driven. And so I started amassing a spreadsheet of where my carbon footprint was going in my direct emissions context. So
this is so sciencey. I love that your instinct is like, okay, step one, realization. Step two, spreadsheet. Let's do this.
Yeah, I know, right? It wasn't exactly like that. On New Year's Day in 2017, I woke up, and I think that tweet is still out there, but I tweeted out that I was making, the first ever climate resolution and committing to walk my children to school twice a week and bike to school twice a week from that day forward. And that really isn't about spreadsheets. That was just about, kind of a Hail Mary. I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. This feels scary, daunting, unrealistic, unattainable, but let's try it out. And so the next step was the spreadsheet, when I began to realize that whatever I wanted to do in terms of wholesale changes was going to have to be data driven. And that I was actually, by the way, curious about how much carbon I was saving in biking to work and walking my kids, et cetera. And so the spreadsheet came in there, and looking at electricity bills, natural gas bills, flights, and automobile miles, and just compiling that over 2017, and really beginning to understand how much room I had to go with efficiency, how much in my home, how much carbon was being emitted through my flying as a platinum frequent flyer with Delta at the time, your average senior scientist, if you will. And just trying to think about a plan that didn't have a time frame, or didn't really even have any targets at that point, for trying to ratchet that down. And 3 years later, I can say that, 2020, I committed to stay on the ground. And this was before all of us were staying on the ground, I need to add that. I committed to stay on the ground, and we'll see what happens in 2021. But flying has become a very small part of my life, and biking has become a daily part of my life. Walking my kids to school has become a daily part of my life. Solar panels have become a daily part of my life, as well as replacing light bulbs, not only in my house, but in every house that I've ever been in, including rental homes. So, it's been a process that has been really rewarding. And it's kind of a personal obsession. It's not for everybody, but it has helped me, by the way, in the process, understand that these individual actions and my own little personal obsessions and numbers also tie up to collective scale engagement and collective scale action. Biking and biking infrastructure being a very obvious link, that now I'm deeply engaged with city level initiatives on pedestrian and biking infrastructure, but also the flying less piece, as contentious as it is. Now I'm on the AGU Sustainable Meetings Committee, which is brand new, thinking about how to reduce carbon across their meetings. So that's another example of the tie between the individual and collective here.
That's great. Yeah. And are there other things that you've been able to get involved with locally through your local government or through your university that have been some leverage points for making some of these choices easier?
Well, certainly I ran for and won a seat on the neighborhood board. So I'm an elected official.
There we go.
I think I had a unanimous vote of 5 people that evening. But at any rate, it's been really...
Congratulations on your victory.
Thank you so much. It cost a fortune. But I was just really excited to learn on a very steep learning curve about how to engage successfully with the City of Atlanta government, how to engage my fellow residents in my neighborhood on issues that I believe should be of mutual concern, but maybe aren't top of mind for them, about our transportation infrastructure and pedestrian safety, et cetera. So that's been incredibly eye-opening and really rewarding, because the board really went from pretty resistant to some of these ideas to kind of baking them into the master plan. And now we're working to implement them. So it takes a lot of time, but I do find it one of the more rewarding aspects of the landscape that I have investigated and explored in the last 3 years.
And when you're called to weigh in on climate science, climate policy in public, when you're giving talks, media interviews, how do you talk about your personal actions and some of these community scale actions? How have you integrated that into your public communication about climate change?
Well, I think it very much depends on venue and audience and purpose. Mm-hmm. And so I like to think of the stories that I can tell as very diverse. I can put on many different kinds of hats, because guess what? I'm a mother to 4 trying to survive this pandemic. I'm a champion for diversity in all its forms through a professional role as well as my own personal undertakings. I'm a climate scientist with stories to tell and data to share and, connections to make. I'm a carbon obsessive who can talk for hours about carbon footprints and the narratives around individual versus collective action. Not all of that is going to fit into a 20-minute conversation or a 20-minute presentation or discussion. So I think to have this rich landscape makes me a more effective communicator. Also makes me more approachable to a broader range of audiences who want different things, frankly. So I don't trot these things out every time. I don't take the frying pan out and beat you over the head with how much I've reduced my carbon footprint and expect to have roses thrown at me at every appearance. This is not what I'm about. This is obviously not the successful approach. But likewise, I think that this kind of conversation belongs in the broader conversation about climate solutions when we excise these kinds of narratives and these kinds of discussions that much of the public has a very keen interest in. We're losing important opportunities for engagement. And so it's not the only thing you'll hear from me, but if you would like to hear about it, I am extremely passionate about it.
So yeah, it sounds like it's like another tool in your tool belt.
That's right.
Yeah. So when people do want to get into this with you, do you feel like it makes you a more credible messenger on the science or on discussing our policy options?
Well, most of the people who want to get into it with me at that level are already in the very concerned and very engaged category. Mm-hmm. People don't normally get into it with me from the other side of the hostile community, and because I'm very much on public record as somebody who cares a lot about carbon and my own footprint, as well as institutional footprints and systems change. So have at it. So the audiences that typically engage me on that really are genuinely concerned, and they really genuinely want to pull out all the stops that they possibly can, and they're eager for a data-driven approach, and they don't feel like the black and white orthodoxy around this discussion on Twitter typically is what they're seeking. They're seeking nuance, but they're also seeking, again, this data.
Yeah, and this is one of those rare areas where I do feel like it really is up to the individual scientist, the individual climate advocate, how they want to approach it, because it is so nuanced and we all live in very different contexts. And there's sort of a rolling debate about whether or not this is something scientists, quote, should, unquote, do to be better communicators or not. And I often find that conversation doesn't have a ton of data behind it. We don't know. And like you said, every audience is different. So I'm wondering what your conversations with other scientists have been like about this, and if those have shifted over time too, because I feel like I've noticed some changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, very vocal members of our community who really find the discussions, in particular around flying less, to be unnecessarily inflammatory, and unnecessary in terms of engaging the public, perhaps even harmful to that engagement that we're trying to achieve collectively, and certainly playing into the hands of the talking points of climate deniers who have long lobbed these barbs, if you will, to our community, saying you're a hypocrite because you get on a plane and you're advocating for reduction in carbon emissions. And so with those reservations, they're pretty quick to say this is a distraction, and this is potentially destructive to the movement. And there are those folks, but then there are a much larger set of folks who sometimes and oftentimes more quietly will approach me, whether it's on social media or in person, and say, I'm really grateful for you speaking out on this issue. Personally, it's not something that sits right with me. And I do think that ultimately we're going to have to see massive changes in the way that we conduct business as usual as scientists and as academics, if we're going to have a hope at achieving, the Paris targets or what we know needs to happen with the mission. So I am bolstered by that. There's typically a strong generational divide there, with the earlier career folks having more appetite for the kinds of broad structural changes that we know need to take place. And, that's in line with their demands for anti-racist engagement in policies across these institutions, as much as it is about the divestment movement, as much as it is about structural changes and how we do business as academics. So it's not just that issue that they care deeply about. They have visions for system-wide changes that they want to be a part of, but they need to look up and see some senior people carrying these torches and risking it in the public eye to take those first steps.
Yeah, I love that you brought up divestment, because I do think that's followed a similar track, where if you had approached a university or an NGO and said, hey, you really need to divest from fossil fuels, and you started that conversation 10 years ago, you would have had a lot of resistance. And even if they agreed with you in principle, the feedback you often got was, well, we don't know how to do that. That sounds too complex. That sounds too complicated. And activists who were into divestment, they were able to find institutions that did agree with them, that were willing to figure it out. And that really broke down a lot of those objections, because then you could point to a university, you could point to an NGO and say, they figured it out. They figured out how to invest their endowment in index funds that don't have fossil fuel companies in them. And it feels like it's a similar track here, where as we've taken the climate crisis more seriously, and as the rising generation has had more of a voice here, just the social reality of other people in your field like you doing this, it's one of the most powerful testaments you have to being able to do that sort of personal and institutional change. Do you feel like more people are coming to you on these topics because you're out there publicly talking about some of these choices?
Yes and no. I mean, it depends on who you mean coming to me. There are definitely folks who really want to lead institutions into like the flying less category, which is a very neat discussion right now, right? But in broader landscapes, definitely, certainly in the South and in Georgia in particular, there are, advocates and champions who are trying to stitch a network together to move forward along any number of different axes in Georgia, and certainly happy to play a key role in my home state and be a reference point, especially for students at Georgia Tech who are looking around for how Georgia Tech is positioned here, who are some resources, and how can we build community. And with that, of course, as director of the Global Change Program, it's a very unique opportunity to learn from the students that we have. What an amazing asset we have at Georgia Tech. And then to think about connecting to other institutions of higher ed in the state and beyond to recognize the potential for the higher ed sector as an agent for change. And that is just one of my core visions that keeps me going on a day-to-day basis and makes me think that I'm in the right place.
One of the things that I found interesting when I was working in Congress on climate issues was that it was very rare for anybody to question why members of Congress might use airplanes, right? Because it's sort of intuitive that you need to get back to your district. And if your district is all the way across the country, you're probably not going to walk or bike
Right.
once a week back to California or Alaska or Kansas or wherever. But, in actually doing scientific work and field work and actually studying what's happening in these ecosystems, could you just talk a little bit about like what the baseline necessity of air travel is to like understand our climate?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's essential. I mean, I'm a field going climate scientist. So I go to the far reaches of the tropical Pacific. Borneo is a long-term research site, as well as a small island in the very middle of the Pacific Ocean called Christmas Island, where I've been working for, 15 and 20 something years respectively. So going out there and studying the environment, collecting samples that are going to help us peer into never before observed portions of time in our climate history are just pivotally important for understanding where we are in terms of providing that context. And you can't do that from your seat at Georgia Tech. It just can't be done. So
you can't get the coral reef to like hop on the Zoom call and say like, please get closer to the camera and take a sample of yourself. And I
mean, it's just not happening. So there's just any number of projects that must go forward that are critically important, that involve pretty far-flung travel in many cases. However, I guess that the critique is really, or I guess it's also a reminder to the listeners that these campaigns are typically logistically extremely complicated. They're very often extremely expensive, and they reflect deep investments by society to understand the results of those projects and their importance in terms of the understanding and knowledge growth of relevant questions. But they're also something that in terms of the flight is just like a smidgen, if you will, of a potential budget that a portion of which could be used to help offset those emissions or otherwise mitigate some of that damage. And so that's something that I think we could easily work towards, is the recognition that at least for academics and especially for those of us who are climate scientists who participate in far-flung necessary research expeditions, I'm thinking about how we can bring to bear the reality, which is these emissions in themselves are fairly costly to society. Perhaps it's a cost that society as a whole would bear if given the choice, given the immense rewards of this research. But also, how can we build structures to reflect that potential back into our budgets in terms of voluntary carbon markets or somehow returning some value to organizations that are working on emissions reductions, et cetera, to at least bake it in. Right now, it's an externality like it is for almost every organization on our planet when we ourselves are calling for that to come to an end. So I don't think it's a black or white here. I think that there's just a need to incorporate this external cost into our thinking and find a way to reflect that in our budgets. It would be a very small line item on most expeditions.
Well, and the last question that I had for you was, just your role as a public scientist, and I'm often struck by all the demands that we place on scientists, right? Produce your scientific research, tell us about all our policy options, but don't tell us what to do. Like, don't be too heavy-handed about it. And then also, like, reduce your own carbon footprint, right? Because I think that's important too. So, do you feel like we kind of demand everything from scientists? Do you feel like you've had the support you've needed as a scientist to like be a communicator and develop policy expertise? It sounds like a lot of this has been, you picking up the mantle and deciding to do a lot of this work yourself.
No, I mean, absolutely. This is a labor of love. And I think that's the key take home for folks that are listening, wondering how they want to engage, or if they're a scientist, what role this kind of work plays in a scientific career, what are the rewards and what are the costs. This is something that I gain immense fulfillment from personally. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't. And I think one of the litmus tests for understanding if you're on the right track and if you're engaging in a meaningful activity is how much return you get on that investment personally. And I hope it's more than you put in, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we need to be getting energy back from the systems and channels and mechanisms we're investing in. And the other thing I would say is that it would be impossible for me in terms of the kind of the categories of activities that I aspire to do well, like, a scientist and a director of a major program and a tweeter and a mother and all these other things. It would be impossible to say that I do them all equally well. And I cannot be everything to all people, but I don't have to be either. I think the most important thing we can do is champion a diversity of voices and a diversity of approaches here, because that is what is going to win the day, not adherence to orthodoxy, not hero worship and coalescing around those few figures who loom so large in this business. That is not going to get us where we need to be. And so again, that's a great opener for folks to come as their true selves and really explore on their own terms what they want to do to position themselves with respect to a scientist, a public communicator, a parent or mother, and all the other different roles that we are charged to take on. So I allow myself, I'm in the pandemic especially, I'm allowing myself to fail on several counts. And when I say fail, I probably mean just doing a little bit less than I would otherwise be able to do. But that's fine, and that's important too. So there's no judge aside from inside, and I hope that folks find the work as rewarding as I do in walking their own personal path.
That is so awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing that wisdom and sharing your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great conversation.
That was a really rich conversation with Dr. Cobb. If you want to follow her online, she has a great Twitter feed. It's at Corals and Caves on Twitter. That's CORALSNCAVES, and that handle will make more sense to you as you engage with her work and all the cool things scientists do to study our past climates. So with that, I hope this was another enriching and educational episode for you. We'll be back again soon. I'm going to be talking about persuasion and what persuasion actually is for folks who work in political communication. And I'm also looking into doing an episode on trolling and the trolls and how to deal with trolls in online spaces and to create better online spaces for all the dialogue that we want to have pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, you name it, online in our digital spaces. So look out for those episodes coming up. As always, feel free to leave me feedback on Twitter. Feel free to leave me feedback on the Patreon. I'm co-creating this with my audience. And Dr. Cobb was somebody who actually signed up for the podcast pretty early. And that's what led me to reach out to her and say, there's this topic that I really think deserves a more nuanced, thoughtful approach in our field that absolutely has some lessons that I think folks can learn on other topics too, as we think about how we engage. That's how I'm developing this. I'm always really happy to talk to folks professionally, and honestly, doing this has been a really fun excuse to just be in touch with people whose work I like and admire, and to be able to elevate them and share what they're doing out with the rest of the world and with the rest of my network. So with that, stay safe out there, wear your masks, wash your hands, watch out for each other. And, if you feel like it, if it's consistent with your personal theory of change, feel free to reduce your own carbon footprint. Thanks.